React Concurrent Mode and Suspense really enable and encourage following a pattern called render as you fetch. And this is a little bit of a mind bender, so I want to give you an example of 3 different ways that we typically fetch data when we're rendering with React. So for our first one, this is fetch on render, and here, this is the code for this one. We have a lazily loaded module. This is our Pokemon info component that we're rendering our Pokemon info into. And we can take a look at that. And inside of this Pokemon info component for this one, we're actually making this useEffect call to actually trigger loading this Pokemon. And then in our actual app here, we have the form that we're rendering out and suspense and error boundary. And the suspense boundary is necessary for the lazily loaded code and not suspending the component. We're actually not suspending at all. We're just using a regular useEffect. So for this one, we've loaded some of the resources and everything, and if I close this out and then I choose Pikachu, for example, then we're going to see we have some code being loaded here. That's the code for the Pokemon info module, and when that code is loaded, then we can make the request for the Pokemon info from the Pokemon GraphQL API that we're hitting, and when that's all loaded, then we can load the Pikachu image. So we get kind of this waterfall effect, where we have to first load the code, and then when the code is loaded, we load the Pokemon information, and when the Pokemon information is loaded, then we load the image. The next thing that people typically do is called fetch then render. So here's an example of fetch then render. You're still lazily loading the code, but the fetch request happens in the parent right here. So we have this use Pokemon custom hook that we're using right here to load that Pokemon. And so when that Pokemon name is updated, then we go ahead and load all of the data. And then once that Pokemon is finally loaded, then we go ahead and render the Pokemon info, which is our component that's lazily loaded. And then we put all the responsibility of loading fallbacks and error handling in the parent. And then if we take a look at this component, it's pretty minimal, but it is being lazily loaded. So let's take a look at what this ends up looking like. So we clear out all of this, and then let's say I want to load Charizard. Then we're going to make that GraphQL request first, then we load the code for it, and then we load the image. So we're still getting a waterfall, it just kind of changed what things are loading first. So the idea behind render as you fetch is quite a bit different. Let's take a look at that code. So here we have this create Pokemon info resource, which is the part of our code that's responsible for loading data. So if we dive into that, it's basically just the create resource stuff with a few more bells and whistles that we'll learn about pretty soon. And then this react.lazy, we're still loading the Pokemon component. It's simply taking that Pokemon resource and reading out the data. In the initial render, it will suspend, and then the parent can manage that loading state through React Suspense. And then when that resolves, it goes ahead and renders the rest out. So let's take a look at what happens in this case. So now if I load in Mew, we're going to get the GraphQL request. And then we also, right here at the left, you can see it's all happening all at once. We're also loading that image, and we're also loading the code. So we're doing it all at exactly the same time, which means things load quite a bit faster, especially if the component that you're lazy loading is actually a lot of code, or the data that you're loading is also a lot of code. So the whole idea behind render as you fetch is you start fetching the data as soon as you have all of the information you need to start fetching the data. And that's what we're going to be working on for the next several exercises, is just working our way toward this idea of render as you fetch. So you can go ahead and read through some of this background information, but for this particular exercise, we have this form right here, and your job is to take this code that we have written with the fetch on render paradigm and switch it over to the render as you fetch paradigm by creating a resource and then suspending inside of Pokemon info and adding a suspense and error boundary around here. And over the course of the next few exercises, we'll iterate to improving this experience further. We also do have some extra credits, so don't miss out on those. We'll learn about suspense and error boundary positioning, and then you absolutely can play around with those fetch approaches that I just showed you in that examples directory. So I encourage you to check that out. All right, so have a good time with this one, and I'll see you on the other side of the exercise.